The invitation arrived on a gray Wednesday morning, slipped between utility bills and supermarket coupons in the mailbox outside a narrow brick house on Alder Street. Melissa Grant almost missed it. She had been distracted, thinking about an order of lilies that needed to be delivered before noon and the leaking pipe in the back room of her flower shop. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, embossed with a gold seal that shimmered faintly in the weak sunlight. It looked expensive, the sort of stationery usually addressed to lawyers, politicians, or the wealthy patrons who lived on the hill overlooking the city. Not to someone like Melissa. Melissa ran a modest flower shop called Petal and Vine, tucked between a laundromat and a bakery on Maple Avenue in the quiet town of Brookhaven. Most days her hands were stained green from stems and soil, and her clothes smelled faintly of roses and eucalyptus. She lived alone in the small house her parents had left her, and aside from a few loyal customers and her assistant Carla, her life moved quietly and predictably. The envelope, however, did not belong to that quiet life. Her name was written across the front in elegant script. Melissa Grant. She frowned slightly, turning the envelope over before opening it with careful fingers. Inside was a thick card. It was an invitation. The Silvercrest Women's Luncheon. The most exclusive social event in Brookhaven. Melissa stared at the words in disbelief. The luncheon was held once a year at the historic Silvercrest Manor, a sprawling estate that overlooked the river. Invitations were reserved for the town's most prominent women, business owners, philanthropists, council members, and the wives of wealthy executives. Melissa had heard about it for years, but had never imagined attending. Not in a million years. At the bottom of the card was a name written in smaller print. Hosted by Victoria Langford. Melissa felt a familiar knot tighten in her chest. Victoria Langford was married to Melissa's older brother, Daniel. And Victoria had never liked her. In fact, dislike was probably the most generous way to describe it. Over the 20 years Victoria had been part of the family, she had always made it clear that Melissa was not the sort of relative she preferred to acknowledge. Melissa wasn't refined enough, wasn't ambitious enough, didn't dress properly, didn't move in the right circles. Victoria had once referred to her as quaint. It had not been meant as a compliment. Melissa was still staring at the invitation when her phone rang. The caller ID read Victoria. Melissa hesitated before answering. Hello. Melissa. Victoria's voice came through bright and polished. I assume you received the invitation. Yes, Melissa said carefully. Wonderful. I insisted that you be included this year. Melissa leaned against the kitchen counter, unsure what to say. That's unexpected.
Victoria laughed lightly.
Oh, please. Your family. Daniel always says we should try to include you more in things. Melissa knew that wasn't true. Her brother had gradually stopped inviting her to family events years ago. Birthdays, holidays, dinners at their house. Somehow Melissa had always been busy when those invitations went out. Or they had simply forgotten to mention them. Still, something in Victoria's voice made Melissa uneasy. But the invitation was real. And despite her doubts, Melissa felt a small spark of hope. Maybe things were changing. Maybe her sister-in-law was finally extending an olive branch. The luncheon was 3 days later. Melissa spent far too much money on a new dress, a soft sage green one that fell just below her knees. It was simple but elegant, and Carla insisted it made her look 10 years younger. Melissa even scheduled an appointment at the salon for the first time in months. You sure about this? Carla asked while tying ribbons around a bouquet. Melissa forced a smile. It's just lunch. Carla raised an eyebrow. It's that lunch. Melissa shrugged. They're just people. But deep down she wasn't sure she believed that. The ballroom at Silvercrest Manor was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, and round tables draped in white linen filled the room. Tall arrangements of orchids and peonies stood at the center of each table. Melissa couldn't help examining the floral work automatically. Whoever arranged them had good technique, though she would have chosen different greenery. Women in designer dresses and sparkling jewelry clustered in small groups, sipping champagne and laughing softly. The air smelled of expensive perfume. Melissa suddenly felt very aware of her modest shoes. Victoria spotted her almost immediately. "There you are," she called, walking across the room. Victoria looked flawless in a fitted cream dress, her dark hair styled perfectly. Her smile appeared warm, but Melissa noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look lovely," Victoria said. "Thank you." Victoria gestured toward a table near the center of the room. "Come sit with us." Melissa followed her through the crowd, feeling dozens of curious glances slide across her. At the table sat four women Melissa vaguely recognized from local charity events and newspaper photos. Victoria introduced her quickly. "This is Daniel's sister, Melissa. I told you about her." The women offered polite smiles. Melissa sat down and reached for the name card in front of her seat. Then she froze. The card didn't say her name. Instead, written in the same elegant script as the invitations, were four words: "The extra guest." For a moment Melissa thought she must have misread it. But when she looked up, she saw the expressions around the table. A few of the women were already suppressing laughter. Victoria lifted her champagne glass slowly. "Oh, Melissa," she said sweetly. "Don't take it personally." The laughter grew louder. Melissa felt heat flood her face. Memories rushed back all at once. Years of subtle insults, awkward silences at family dinners, the way Victoria had always managed to make her feel small without ever saying anything openly cruel. This had been planned. She had been invited as entertainment. A joke. Melissa slowly placed the name card back on the table. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she looked directly at Victoria. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm. "Since I'm apparently today's entertainment," she said quietly, "perhaps I should share something interesting." Victoria's smile faltered slightly. Melissa folded her hands neatly in front of her. "Would you like me to tell everyone about the messages?" The room fell silent.
Victoria blinked.
"What messages?" Melissa tilted her head slightly. "The ones you've been sending to Mr. Carter." Across the ballroom, Margaret Carter, the luncheon's primary sponsor, suddenly turned toward them. Victoria's face went pale, and the laughter around the table vanished instantly. Melissa leaned back calmly in her chair. "Because if we're sharing jokes," she said softly, "that one might be the funniest of all." The laughter that had filled the Silvercrest ballroom only minutes earlier dissolved into a tense silence that spread across the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Women who had been casually sipping champagne now leaned slightly toward the table where Melissa and Victoria sat, pretending not to listen while straining to catch every word. Victoria Langford, who only moments before had been smiling confidently, now looked as if the floor beneath her chair had shifted unexpectedly. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, and the practiced elegance she normally wore like armor began to crack. "What are you talking about?" Victoria asked, her voice controlled but noticeably thinner than before. Melissa watched her calmly. For years she had been on the receiving end of Victoria's quiet humiliations, subtle remarks, carefully placed exclusions, polite insults disguised as concern. But something had changed inside her in that moment when she saw the words written on the name card in front of her seat. For the first time, she wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine. "The messages," Melissa repeated evenly, "between you and Mr. Carter." Margaret Carter, seated 2 tables away, had already risen slightly from her chair. Her husband, Thomas Carter, was one of Brookhaven's most successful real estate developers and a regular donor to nearly every charity event in town. Margaret herself chaired the Silvercrest Luncheon Committee and was widely known for her composure and influence. Now that composure was visibly slipping. Victoria gave a short laugh that sounded forced. "Melissa, that's absurd." But the confidence in her voice had weakened. Melissa didn't raise her voice.
She didn't need to.
The quiet tone seemed to draw more attention than shouting would have. 3 months ago, she said, you came into my shop to order flowers for Daniel's birthday dinner. You remember that? Victoria said nothing. You left your phone on the counter when you left, Melissa continued. I was trying to find her contact information to call you when a message popped up. Victoria's face had lost almost all color. I didn't go looking for anything, Melissa added calmly. But the message preview appeared on the screen. Across the ballroom, Margaret Carter slowly began walking toward their table. Victoria noticed her, and panic flickered in her eyes. You should be careful about inventing stories, Victoria said quickly, her voice tightening. People might think you're jealous. Melissa tilted her head slightly. Jealous of what? For a moment Victoria had no answer. Margaret Carter stopped beside the table. What messages? She asked sharply. The other women at the table shifted uncomfortably, suddenly wishing they were somewhere else entirely. A few guests nearby pretended to be absorbed in their phones, though their eyes kept drifting back toward the confrontation. Victoria stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous, she said. Melissa clearly misunderstood something. Melissa remained seated. I only saw one message, she said quietly, but it was from Thomas. Margaret Carter turned slowly toward Victoria. The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Victoria opened her mouth to respond but hesitated just long enough for doubt to take root in the room. That hesitation was enough. Margaret's expression hardened. I think, she said coldly, this conversation should continue somewhere private. The tension that had been building finally cracked open. Within minutes, the ballroom erupted into whispered conversations. Some guests quietly stood and moved toward the doors, eager to avoid being present when the situation escalated further. Others stayed where they were, fascinated by the unfolding drama. Melissa stood and quietly left the table. She had not planned what happened next. She had not imagined standing up in front of Brookhaven's most powerful women and exposing her sister-in-law in the middle of the town's most prestigious luncheon. But once the moment came, something inside her refused to stay silent any longer. Outside the manor, the afternoon air felt cooler and calmer. Melissa walked down the stone steps slowly, her heart finally beginning to pound now that the adrenaline was fading. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached the parking lot. She knew what this meant. Victoria would not forgive her. Daniel would certainly not forgive her. And in a town like Brookhaven, reputations traveled quickly. She drove home in silence. The phone rang less than an hour later. Daniel. Melissa let it go to voicemail. A few seconds later the message notification appeared. His voice, when she played it back, sounded angrier than she had ever heard. What were you thinking, Melissa? He demanded. Do you have any idea what you've done? Victoria is humiliated. You embarrassed her in front of half the town. You've always been resentful of us, but this is unbelievable. Melissa closed her eyes as she listened. You've always tried to make us look bad, Daniel continued. This is exactly why Victoria never wanted you involved in our social circle. The message ended abruptly. Melissa set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there quietly. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It wasn't joyful laughter. It was the kind that comes when something long broken finally snaps completely. The doorbell rang later that evening. Melissa opened the door expecting to see Daniel standing there, ready to continue the argument in person. Instead, she found a young woman standing nervously on the porch. Emma Langford, Victoria and Daniel's daughter. Emma was 21, a university student who rarely visited Melissa alone. Over the years, Victoria had carefully ensured that Emma stayed busy whenever Melissa invited her over for holidays or dinner. Now Emma stood there with red eyes and a small backpack slung over her shoulder. Aunt Melissa, she said quietly. Can I come in? Melissa stepped aside immediately. Emma sat at the kitchen table while Melissa made tea, though Emma barely touched the cup once it was placed in front of her. Mom and Dad are fighting, Emma said finally. Melissa wasn't surprised. What happened at the luncheon? Emma continued, twisting her fingers nervously. Dad didn't know anything about it. Melissa nodded slowly. I never intended for it to happen like that. Emma looked up. Is it true? Melissa hesitated. I only saw one message, she admitted. But yes, I believe it's true. Emma stared down at the table again. I'm not surprised, she whispered. Melissa frowned slightly. What do you mean? Emma sighed quietly. Mom always needs to be admired, she said. Everything has to be perfect. The house, the parties, the way people see us. If something isn't exciting enough, she finds ways to make it exciting. Melissa felt a small ache in her chest hearing that. Emma continued softly. She talks about you a lot. Melissa raised an eyebrow. I can imagine. Emma shook her head. Not the way you think. Melissa waited. Emma finally looked up. She says you're dangerous. Melissa blinked. Dangerous? Emma nodded. Because you don't care about the things she cares about. For a moment, Melissa didn't know what to say. Outside, a car drove slowly past the house. Emma took a deep breath. I don't want to go home tonight, she said quietly. Melissa studied her niece's tired face. Then she smiled gently. You don't have to. Emma's shoulders relaxed for the first time since she arrived. But neither of them noticed the dark sedan parked across the street, and the woman sitting inside it, watching the house carefully. Victoria Langford had never been the type to lose control, and she wasn't about to start now. By the following morning, the story had already begun to spread across Brookhaven. In a town where reputations traveled faster than traffic on Main Street, the Silvercrest Luncheon scandal had become the only topic anyone seemed interested in discussing. Melissa noticed at the moment she opened her flower shop. Two women who had been chatting quietly near the display of roses immediately lowered their voices when she walked in. One of them gave her a quick, polite smile before leaving hurriedly, while the other pretended to examine a bouquet with unusual concentration. Melissa pretended not to notice. She had lived in Brookhaven her entire life, and she understood exactly how these things worked. People didn't confront scandals directly. They whispered around them. Emma had spent the night in the small guest room at Melissa's house, and that morning the two of them had arrived together at Petal and Vine. Melissa could see that Emma still looked tired, but there was also something lighter in her expression, as if the decision to step away from her parents' house had lifted a weight she had been carrying quietly for years. Carla, the shop assistant, noticed Emma immediately and raised an eyebrow at Melissa, but wisely chose not to ask questions. Instead, she focused on preparing an arrangement of daisies for a regular customer who came in every Thursday morning. The bell above the shop door rang again. Melissa looked up expecting another customer. Instead, she saw Margaret Carter standing in the doorway. Margaret looked different from the polished woman Melissa had seen at the luncheon. Her hair was pulled back simply, and her expression carried a sharp tension that hadn't been there before. The air inside the shop suddenly felt heavier. Emma noticed her too. Oh, Emma murmured quietly. Carla glanced between the women and slowly retreated toward the back room, sensing the conversation that was about to happen wasn't meant for an audience. Margaret stepped inside. The scent of fresh lilies filled the room. So this is your shop, she said, glancing around at the rows of flowers and buckets of greenery. Melissa wiped her hands on her apron. Yes. Margaret walked slowly past the counter, studying the arrangements displayed along the wall. I've driven past this place dozens of times, she said. Strange that I've never come inside. Melissa said nothing. Margaret turned toward her. You caused quite a scene yesterday. Melissa met her gaze calmly. I told the truth. Margaret studied her face carefully. Did you? For a moment, neither woman spoke. Emma sat quietly near the window, watching nervously. Finally, Margaret sighed. My husband moved out this morning, she said. Melissa felt a small pang of guilt. I'm sorry. Margaret laughed softly, though there was no humor in the sound. Are you? Melissa hesitated. I didn't mean for it to happen like that. Margaret crossed her arms. But you knew what would happen. Melissa looked down briefly at the stems she had been trimming. I kept quiet for months, she admitted. Yesterday, I was just tired of being treated like a joke. Margaret considered that. The tension in her posture softened slightly. Victoria told everyone you fabricated the whole thing. Melissa nodded. That sounds like her. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She also said you've always been unstable, that you've been resentful of her success since she married your brother. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Melissa, however, didn't react. If people want to believe that, she said calmly, I can't stop them. Margaret watched her for several seconds. Then she asked quietly, Do you have proof? Melissa shook her head. I only saw one message. Margaret absorbed this silently. Finally, she exhaled slowly. Thomas confessed last night. Melissa blinked in surprise. Margaret looked toward the window. So, the truth didn't really need proof after all. Silence filled the shop again. Margaret walked toward the door, then paused. I won't be ordering flowers here anymore, she said. Melissa felt her stomach tighten but nodded. I understand. Margaret continued. And the Brookhaven Garden Society will be using another florist for the spring gala. That news landed harder. The Garden Society contract had been Melissa's largest event every year. Margaret opened the door but hesitated one last time. You shouldn't have protected Victoria for so long, she said quietly. Then she left. The bell above the door rang sharply as it closed. Emma stared at Melissa. That wasn't fair. Melissa forced a small smile. Life rarely is. But the real damage didn't stop there. Over the next week, several regular clients quietly canceled their standing orders. A restaurant that had purchased fresh arrangements every Friday suddenly decided to try a different vendor. A hotel downtown informed Melissa that they would be reviewing their floral contracts. Carla tried to stay optimistic, but even she couldn't hide her worry when the shop grew quieter each day. The rumors had clearly taken hold. Victoria had moved quickly. In Brookhaven social circles, reputation was everything, and Victoria Langford had spent years building hers. If she wanted people to believe Melissa had invented the scandal out of jealousy, many of them were willing to accept that explanation without asking too many questions. Melissa was restocking tulips one afternoon when the shop door opened again. Emma looked up from the counter. Aunt Melissa? Melissa turned. Daniel stood in the doorway. He looked tired. Not angry the way he had sounded on the voicemail message, just worn down. Emma stiffened immediately.
That.
Daniel looked surprised to see her. You weren't answering your phone. Emma crossed her arms. I know. Daniel stepped further into the shop. His eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the buckets of flowers, the shelves, the small chalkboard menu Emma had started using to advertise seasonal arrangements. I haven't been here in years, he said quietly. Melissa didn't respond. Daniel turned toward her. You embarrass my wife. Melissa met his gaze. I exposed something she was hiding. Daniel's jaw tightened. Victoria says you made it up. Emma stood up suddenly. That's not true. Daniel blinked. You believe her? I saw the messages too, Emma said firmly. Daniel stared at his daughter in shock. The room fell silent. Emma's voice trembled slightly, but she continued. Mom's been lying for months. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. You don't understand the damage this has caused. Melissa spoke quietly. No, Daniel. The damage was already there. Daniel looked at her sharply. You've always been jealous. Melissa almost laughed. Jealous of what? But Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer. Victoria has friends in this town, he said quietly. Important ones. Melissa understood immediately. You mean the clients who suddenly stopped calling? Daniel didn't deny it. If this continues, he said, your shop won't survive the year. Emma stared at him in disbelief. You'd really do that? Daniel looked uncomfortable. I'm protecting my family. Emma shook her head. You mean you're protecting Mom? For a moment, Daniel had no reply. Then he turned toward the door. If you want to come home, he told Emma, call me. Emma didn't move. Daniel left without another word. The bell rang again as the door closed behind him. Melissa stood quietly in the middle of the shop. For the first time since the luncheon, She allowed herself to feel afraid. Because Daniel might be right. If Victoria kept pushing, Petal and Vine might not survive Brookhaven's whispers. And Melissa had no idea yet that someone else in town had been watching everything very carefully. Someone who had just decided it was time to step in. The weeks following Daniel's visit were some of the hardest Melissa had experienced since opening Petal and Vine 15 years earlier. The shop still smelled of fresh flowers every morning, but the steady rhythm of customers coming and going had changed. The bell above the door rang less often. Deliveries that once filled the shop with early morning activity had become smaller and more irregular. Carla tried to keep the atmosphere cheerful, arranging bouquets with extra care and chatting with the few customers who came in, but even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes when she thought Melissa wasn't looking. Emma, however, had thrown herself into helping with a determination that surprised Melissa. She redesigned the shop's small website, started posting photographs of new arrangements on social media, and even convinced Melissa to add a small coffee corner near the front window where customers could sit and talk. Slowly, a few younger residents of Brookhaven began stopping in just to look around, sometimes staying longer than expected. Still, the damage caused by Victoria's quiet campaign was obvious. Rumors moved through Brookhaven like wind through tall grass, invisible but powerful enough to bend everything in their path. According to the whispers, Melissa had fabricated the Luncheon story out of resentment. According to others, she had misunderstood an innocent message and turned it into a scandal for attention. A few versions even suggested Melissa had always been unstable, repeating the same narrative Victoria had carefully planted in conversations around town. Melissa tried not to think about it while she worked, but every canceled order reminded her. One afternoon, while she was trimming hydrangeas behind the counter, the bell above the door rang again. Melissa glanced up automatically, expecting another curious passerby or perhaps one of the younger customers Emma had started attracting. Instead, she saw a woman she immediately recognized. Margaret Carter had returned. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was another familiar figure, Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who chaired Brookhaven's Municipal Garden Foundation and one of the most influential philanthropists in the region. Eleanor was known for organizing the annual Spring Garden Gala, the most prestigious charity event in town aside from the Silvercrest Luncheon itself. Melissa straightened slowly. This visit was unexpected. Eleanor stepped forward, glancing around the shop with thoughtful interest. She paused beside a display of white peonies arranged in a wide ceramic bowl. "These are beautiful," she said. "Thank you," Melissa replied. Margaret remained near the door, watching quietly. Eleanor turned toward Melissa with a composed expression that carried both intelligence and authority. Unlike Victoria's polished social charm, Eleanor's presence felt calmer, more deliberate. "I believe we've never officially met," Eleanor said.
I'm Eleanor Whitmore.
Melissa nodded. "I know who you are." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I suspected as much." For a moment the three women stood in silence, surrounded by the soft fragrance of flowers. Then Eleanor spoke again. "I heard about what happened at the luncheon." Melissa waited. "In fact," Eleanor continued, "it was impossible not to hear about it." Melissa gave a small, tired smile. "Brookhaven doesn't keep secrets very well." Eleanor nodded. "No, it doesn't." She walked slowly around the shop, studying the arrangements with careful attention. She paused near the new coffee corner Emma had created and noticed Emma sitting at a small table with a laptop. "And you must be Emma," Eleanor said kindly. Emma looked up, surprised. "Yes." Eleanor glanced back toward Melissa. "You've been helping here?" Emma nodded. "For the past few weeks." Eleanor seemed pleased. "Good." She turned back toward Melissa. "I assume you know that Margaret and I spoke after the luncheon." Melissa looked briefly toward Margaret, who gave a small nod. "I imagined you might." Eleanor folded her hands in front of her. "Margaret's marriage is ending." Melissa felt a quiet sadness, but said nothing. However, Eleanor continued, The garden foundation's work continues regardless of personal difficulties. Melissa still didn't understand why Eleanor had come. Then Eleanor reached into her bag and removed a folder. The Spring Garden Gala is next month. Melissa's heart skipped. The event requires a considerable amount of floral work, Eleanor said calmly. Centerpieces for 30 tables, decorative installations for the entrance hall, and several arrangements for the outdoor terrace. Melissa felt her pulse quicken. The Garden Gala contract was easily the largest floral commission in Brookhaven each year. Eleanor placed the folder gently on the counter. I would like Petal and Vine to handle the arrangements. Melissa blinked. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood. Are you sure? She asked quietly. Eleanor met her gaze directly. Very. Margaret stepped forward slightly. Some people might not like it, Margaret admitted. That part didn't surprise Melissa. Victoria's influence in Brookhaven's social circles was strong, and giving such a visible contract to Melissa would certainly attract attention. Eleanor, however, seemed unconcerned. Brookhaven has allowed too many people to mistake reputation for truth, she said calmly. I prefer to work with talent. She gestured toward the flowers surrounding them. And your work speaks for itself. Melissa opened the folder slowly. Inside were sketches, event details, and a formal contract outlining the scope of the project. The numbers alone were enough to stabilize the shop for months. Emma looked over Melissa's shoulder and gasped quietly. This could save the shop, she whispered. Melissa looked back up at Eleanor. Why me? Eleanor smiled slightly. Because Victoria believes she controls this town's social narrative. Her eyes sharpened. I think it's time someone reminded her that influence doesn't belong to one person. Margaret allowed herself a faint smile as well. And because, she added, the arrangements you created for my anniversary dinner 2 years ago were the most beautiful flowers I've ever seen. Melissa closed the folder slowly. For weeks, she had felt as though the ground beneath her life was crumbling. Now, suddenly, someone had offered her a chance not only to recover, but to stand openly in front of the same social circles that had tried to push her aside. Then I accept, she said. Eleanor nodded once, satisfied. Good. Before leaving, Eleanor paused near the shop door. Oh, and one more thing. Melissa looked up. You will be attending the gala as a guest. Melissa hesitated. I usually deliver flowers and leave. Not this time, Eleanor replied firmly. You deserve to be seen. After they left, the shop remained quiet for several seconds. Then Emma suddenly laughed. Mom is going to lose her mind when she hears about this. Melissa smiled faintly. Yes, she said softly. She probably will. But across town, in a large white house at the top of Brookhaven Hill, Victoria Langford had already heard the news. And the expression on her face suggested she was not planning to accept it quietly. The morning of the Spring Garden Gala arrived with clear skies and the soft warmth of early May sunlight spreading across Brookhaven. Melissa had been awake since before dawn, moving carefully through the flower shop as she prepared the final arrangements that would soon fill the grand halls of the Brookhaven Conservatory. Buckets of freshly delivered roses, peonies, hydrangeas, and ivy lined the work tables, and the entire space smelled like a garden after rain. Carla worked beside her, tying ribbons around the bases of tall centerpieces while Emma checked the delivery lists on a tablet, making sure nothing had been overlooked. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation, sketches, flower shipments, and late nights spent perfecting every detail of Eleanor Whitmore's ambitious vision for the gala. Melissa had approached the project with the same quiet dedication she had always given her work, but this time there was something different beneath her calm focus. This event wasn't just another job. It was a chance to reclaim her place in a town that had nearly written her off. The conservatory itself was a magnificent glass building surrounded by landscaped gardens and winding stone paths that overlooked the river valley. By mid-morning, Melissa's van was already parked near the service entrance, and she and her team began unloading the arrangements one by one. Inside, sunlight poured through the glass ceiling and scattered across the marble floors. Volunteers moved around setting tables, adjusting linens, and placing small candles in delicate holders. Eleanor stood near the center of the room reviewing final details with the event staff, her calm authority guiding the organized chaos of last-minute preparations. When she saw Melissa enter with the first arrangement, Eleanor walked over immediately. She studied the tall structure of white peonies, pale blue delphiniums, and cascading ivy for several seconds before nodding with quiet satisfaction. "Exactly what I hoped for," she said. Melissa allowed herself a small smile. Compliments from Eleanor were rare and sincere, and hearing those words eased some of the tension that had been sitting in her chest for days. By early afternoon, the conservatory had transformed into something extraordinary. 30 tables were arranged beneath the glass dome, each decorated with elegant floral centerpieces that looked as if they had grown naturally out of the linen-covered surfaces. The main entrance was framed with tall arches of greenery and blooming branches that created the impression of walking through a living garden. Along the terrace overlooking the river, Melissa had designed a series of low arrangements filled with wildflowers and soft greenery that moved gently in the breeze. Emma stepped back beside her and looked around the room in amazement. "Aunt Melissa," she said quietly, "this looks incredible." Melissa followed her gaze across the space and felt a rare sense of pride. For years she had worked quietly behind the scenes, creating arrangements for weddings, restaurants, and small events without expecting recognition. Today, however, her work filled the most important event of the season. Eleanor approached again, carrying a garment bag draped carefully over her arm. "You're not leaving before the event begins," she said firmly. Melissa looked surprised. "I thought I'd finish setting everything up and head back to the shop." Eleanor shook her head. "Not tonight." She handed over the bag. "I took the liberty of arranging something appropriate for you to wear." Inside the bag was a simple navy evening dress, elegant without being extravagant, exactly the kind of style Melissa might have chosen if she had ever allowed herself the expense. Emma's eyes widened. "You have to stay," she insisted. "Everyone should see that you did this." Melissa hesitated for a moment, but Eleanor's steady expression left little room for argument. "All right," Melissa said finally. By evening, the conservatory had filled with guests. Brookhaven's most prominent residents arrived in polished cars, stepping onto the garden paths in formal attire while the setting sun reflected off the glass walls of the building. Melissa stood near the entrance, feeling slightly nervous in the navy dress, but determined to remain composed. Some guests nodded politely when they recognized her. Others glanced at the flowers with clear admiration before noticing who had designed them. Eleanor soon joined her near the doorway. "You look perfect," she said approvingly. Melissa thanked her quietly. As the crowd moved through the entrance, a familiar voice spoke from behind them. "Melissa." She turned to see Daniel standing a few steps away. He looked uncomfortable, his formal jacket slightly rumpled as if he had been adjusting it repeatedly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I didn't realize you would be here tonight," Daniel finally said. Melissa gestured lightly toward the hall filled with flowers. "I did the arrangements." Daniel looked around slowly, clearly impressed despite himself. "They're remarkable," he admitted. His voice softened slightly. "Emma seems happy working with you." Melissa nodded. "She's doing very well." Daniel hesitated before reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded document and handed it to her. Melissa opened it carefully and felt her breath catch. It was a deed to a small piece of land on the edge of town. "Dad left that for you," Daniel said quietly. "I found the papers recently when sorting through his old files. Victoria convinced me years ago that you didn't need to know about it." Melissa stared at the document in disbelief. "It was always meant to be yours," Daniel continued. "I should have told you sooner." Before Melissa could respond, another figure approached them.
Victoria.
Her elegant dress and confident posture looked unchanged, but the tension in her eyes revealed how little control she felt in the moment. She looked from Daniel to Melissa, clearly unhappy to see them standing together. "What is she doing here?" Victoria asked sharply. Daniel's voice carried an edge Melissa had never heard before. She was invited. Victoria's expression hardened. Of course she was. At that moment, Eleanor's voice echoed through the conservatory as she welcomed the guests and invited everyone to take their seats. Melissa folded the deed carefully and placed it in her bag. Then, without another word to Victoria, she turned and walked toward the main table where Eleanor and Emma were waiting. Dinner passed in a warm blur of conversation, music, and applause as Eleanor thanked the volunteers and donors who supported the foundation. Throughout the evening, Melissa noticed guests admiring the flowers, many asking who had designed them. Eleanor made sure they heard the answer clearly. 1 year later, the storefront of Petal and Vine looked very different. The small piece of land Daniel had returned to Melissa had been sold to a developer for a generous price, allowing her to expand the shop into the vacant building next door. The new space had become a welcoming gathering area with coffee, plants, and comfortable chairs where community groups often met. Emma had become a full partner in the business while finishing her degree, bringing new ideas and energy that helped the shop thrive. On a bright spring morning, Melissa stood outside the expanded shop while Emma adjusted the new sign above the door, Petal and Vine, flowers and community space. The bell jingled inside as Carla welcomed a group of regular customers settling into the coffee corner. Emma handed Melissa a cream-colored envelope that had arrived in the morning mail. Melissa recognized the design instantly. Another invitation to the Silvercrest Women's Tea. Emma smiled. Are you going to go? Melissa looked at the envelope thoughtfully before nodding. Yes, she said calmly. A year earlier, she had been invited as a joke. Now she would attend as herself. And that made all the difference.